Hello everyone. Well, the skull is going to be divided into two different types of bones. We have a group that's called the cranial bones, which we're covering here, and we have another group that's called the facial bones, which we will cover later on. The skull is going to be this bony framework of the head. It can be divided into two sets of bones. We're going to have the cranial bones and the facial bones. There are 8 cranial bones and 14 facial bones for a total of 22 bones. It is important to note that these do not include the middle ear bones, which we will cover later on in this module. The cranial bones, they're going to form the cranial cavity, which will enclose and protect the brain. That's why it's called the cranial bones. This means that all of the cranial bones will be in close contact with the brain. Like I said earlier, there are 8 cranial bones, and on this figure, they're all highlighted here in red. These will consist of a total of 4 flat bones, which are the frontal bone, the 2 parietal bones, and the occipital bone. 2 irregular types of bones, which are the temporal, of which we have 2 of them, 1 on each side of the skull, and the sphenoid bone, which is the other irregular bone. And the last type of bone is the ethmoid bone, that is considered to be a pneumatized bone. Remember, it's the one that has all the little pockets. The way that I remember all these cranial bones is by thinking that the cranial bones are going to be formed by all 4 bones that have the easy names, and that will also represent the lobes in the brain, which are the frontal, the parietal, the occipital, and the temporal. In addition to the 2 that have complicated but similar names, which are the sphenoid and the ethmoid bones. So all these bones will be the cranial bones, and therefore all the other bones in the skull will be considered facial bones. And like the name says, facial bones means that these bones will be the ones that will form the face. In this figure, they are the ones that are highlighted here in blue. They are the 2 nasal bones right over here, the 2 maxilla, the 2 zygomatic bones, 1 mandible, 2 lacrimal bones, 2 palatine bones, 2 inferior nasal conchae, and the vomer, which there's only 1 of. Most of these bones, they're said to be paired, meaning they have a right and a left. Just like when you say you have a pair of shoes, right? You mean that you have a right and a left shoe. Here's the same thing. There will be a right and a left bone, but some are unpaired, meaning that there is only one, and because there's only one, it will be located centrally, right down the middle. The unpaired are the sphenoid, the ethmoid, the frontal, and the occipital. These are cranial bones. The vomer and the mandible, which are facial bones. All other skull bones are going to be paired, again, meaning that there are 2 of each bone, a right and a left one. The cranial bones, they have other functions in addition to protecting the brain. Their inner surfaces are going to attach to membranes, which are called meninges, that will function to stabilize the position of the brain in addition to blood vessels and nerves. The outer surfaces of the cranial bones, they're going to provide this large area of attachment for muscles that move various parts of the head, and the bones are also going to provide attachment for some muscles that are going to be involved in producing facial expression, which we will talk more about the facial expressions when we get to the muscle module. Besides forming this framework of the face, the facial bones, they protect and provide support for entrances of the digestive and the respiratory system. Together, the cranial and the facial bones, they're going to protect and support the delicate special sense organs for vision, taste, smell, hearing, and equilibrium, which we will talk about when we get to the nervous system. The auditory ossicles of the middle ear, they're going to help to amplify the sound waves to make hearing possible, and these we will cover a little bit here in this module, but we will definitely talk more about them when we get to the nervous system. On this image, we can see all the cranial bones, which are the frontal bone here in blue, the parietal bones, which we have 1 on each side here in pink, the occipital bone, which is located in the base of the brain posteriorly, the temporal bone, which we have one on each side, and then we have the two that have the very complicated but similar names, which are the sphenoid and the ethmoid bones. So we will talk about them in more details in the next few slides. In addition to forming the large cranial cavity that will house the brain, the skull also forms several smaller cavities, including the nasal cavity and the orbits, which are the eye sockets where your eyes are going to be located. And these, they do open to the exterior. There are certain skull bones that also contain cavities that are called paranasal sinuses that are going to be lined with mucous membranes, and these open into the nasal cavity. Also within the skull are small middle and inner ear cavities in the temporal bone that will house the structures that are going to be involved in hearing and equilibrium or balance, which are the auditory ossicles. In addition to these cavities, it's important to let you know that the auditory ossicles, the occipital bone, and the mandible are going to be the only bones of the skull that are actually going to be moving. So the auditory ossicles, they're going to move to produce the sound. The occipital bone is going to be important because it will allow you to shake your head yes, as it sits on top of the first vertebrae, and we will talk more about this. And the mandible, once it moves up and down, it allows you to chew your food. Most of the skull bones, they're held together by sutures, which are these joints that will attach the bones together and that are going to be especially noticeable on the outer surface of the skull. There are 4 sutures that we will talk about, but we can see them a little bit over here. The one that will unite the frontal bone right over here with the parietal bone is going to be called the coronal suture. The one that's going to unite the parietal bone to the occipital bone is what we call the lambdoidal suture or lambdoid suture. The one that unites the parietal bone with the temporal bone is what we call the squamous suture or squamosal suture. And the last one is what will unite the parietal bones right over here. The right and left parietal bones are going to be united by the sagittal suture. Let's start with the frontal bone. The frontal bone is going to form the forehead, which is basically the anterior part of the cranium. It will also form the roof of the orbit or the eye socket, but we will cover the eye socket later on in this module, and most of the interior part of the cranial floor. There are a couple of bone features that we need to know for the frontal bone, which are the supraorbital foramen, one on each side. So this is a hole. As the name says, it's a foramen, and because it's located on top of the orbit, it's going to be called the supraorbital foramen. And we have one on each side. You're going to have blood vessels and nerves that will pass through them, but we really don't focus on the specifics of those nerves and blood vessels. Next, we have the parietal bones, which are these large quadrilateral, meaning that there are 4 sides to it, bones that will form the greater portion actually of the sides and the roof of the cranial cavity. Each bone will articulate with 5 other bones, which are the frontal bone right over here at the coronal suture, the temporal bone right over here at the squamous suture. It does articulate a little bit with the sphenoid bone over here, which is this bone in green, and then it will articulate posteriorly with the occipital bone, and right here on the sagittal suture, which is the suture right on top of the skull, it will articulate with the other parietal bone, as we can see on this inferior view over here. So it will articulate the right parietal bone with the left parietal bone on the sagittal suture. Because these are very flat bones and they do have a few features, but they're not very pronounced, we really don't cover the bone features for the parietal bone. The 2 temporal bones, they're going to form the inferior lateral aspect of the cranium and also part of the cranial floor where the brain will sit on top. The term temporal comes from tempo, which actually means time, so it's a reference to the graying of the hair in the temple area as the time passes. So that's where the name temporal comes from. There are a few bone features that you need to know for the temporal bone. The first one has to do with this process right over here, which is called the zygomatic process, as it will articulate with the zygomatic bone, which is your cheekbone. Next, we have what we call the mandibular fossa. The mandibular fossa, remember, fossa is a depression, so it's going to be located right over here, and this depression is going to articulate with this process of the mandible, which is the jaw bone right over here. Then we have what we call the external auditory canal, which is this opening right over here. If we have an external, we're also going to have an internal auditory or acoustic canal or meatus. So they're all interchangeable names. You can use auditory or acoustic, or you can use canal and meatus. And from the image, you can see that the external is located on the outside. Therefore, the internal acoustic canal or internal auditory meatus is located on the inside. So it's this hole right over here. Then you can see right over here, we're going to have this other process that sticks out over here. This is called the styloid process. It does look like a little styloid pen. And then we're going to have this big bump over here, which is called the mastoid process. Now, all these processes, they will serve as muscle attachment. And then the last bone feature that we need to know for the temporal bone is the carotid canal. The carotid canal is this big depression right over here, and we can see it on the inferior view of the skull. And the carotid canal is where the carotid artery will pass through. For you to be able to orient yourself into localizing the carotid canal, because sometimes it's a little bit hard, notice how it's going to be medial to the styloid process on both sides. So these are your styloid processes on both sides. And then we also have the mastoid process sticking out right over here. So this will give you an orientation of where to look for the carotid canal. Now we're going to be covering the occipital bone. Occipital means back of the head, and that's exactly where it's going to be located. It will form the posterior part and also most of the base of the cranium where the brain will sit. The bone features that you need to know for the occipital bone are the foramen magnum, which is easy. Foramen means a hole and magnum means big. So it's going to be this huge hole right over here where the spinal cord will pass through. Then we have the occipital condyle. We know that a condyle is a smooth, rounded, articulating surface. So these surfaces right over here, they do look very smooth compared, for example, to the bone right over here that shows lots of little indentations. And here is where the skull will articulate with the first cervical vertebrae. Then we have the hypoglossal canal. Hypo means below, glossal means tongue. Therefore, it's going to be an opening or a canal where the hypoglossal nerve will pass through. And it's going to be located right over here above the occipital condyle. So sometimes it's a little bit hard for you to see, but if you can visualize the occipital condyle, you can see the opening right over there. Then we have the next one, which is called the jugular foramen. Now the jugular foramen, I did put it over here under the occipital bone, but it's really a shared feature between the occipital bone, which is here in orange, and the temporal bone, which is here in purple. And this opening right over here, and you can see it on the other side as well, see how there's part of the temporal bone and part of the occipital bone? This will form the jugular foramen. Your jugular vein is the one that will pass through the jugular foramen. Now notice how right above the jugular foramen, you're going to have this other hole here, which is the carotid canal. Now usually blood vessels, they have the same name. For example, you have the femoral artery and the femoral vein, the radial artery, the radial vein. In this case, the artery and vein, they receive different names, even though they're the ones that correspond to each other. So the carotid artery will be the one that will correspond to the jugular vein. The carotid artery will pass through the carotid canal and take blood from the heart to the brain. And the jugular foramen will be the vein that will bring the blood from the brain to the heart. So it makes sense that the openings are going to be close to each other. And this is important for you to try to localize these openings because sometimes, especially the carotid canal, it can be a little bit hard. But look how the occipital condyle is located right over here, which is easy to locate. Right to the lateral of it, you have this big hole, which is the jugular foramen. And then right above it, you're going to have the carotid canal. And they're always going to be close to each other. The sphenoid bone is the bone that will lie at the middle part of the base of the skull. Sphenoid means a wedge shaped, and that's exactly what it is. It looks actually like a butterfly bone. If you look at this image here in green, representing the whole sphenoid bone. And this bone can also be called the keystone of the cranial floor because it will actually articulate with all the other cranial bones, holding them together. When you view the sphenoid bone in a superior view, like we can see over here on this image to the right, you're going to see that it will articulate anteriorly with the frontal bone and with the ethmoid bone right over here. It will articulate laterally with the temporal bone and with the parietal bone, and it will also articulate with the occipital bone posteriorly. So it does articulate with all the cranial bones. With regards to bone features, the first one that I want you to know is the sella turcica, which is this big depression right over here in the middle of the sphenoid bone. The sella turcica will house the pituitary gland, which is this very important gland, and that's why it has its own little compartment within the sella turcica. Then if we come over here, we can see the optic canal, which is this tiny little hole right over there. The optic canal will be the hole where the optic nerve will pass through. Then we have the superior orbital fissure, which is that slit right over there, located superiorly. We can also see it right over here on this image. And then we have what we call the inferior orbital fissure. So if we have a superior orbital fissure, we're going to have an inferior orbital fissure. A fissure means that it's an elongated cut, and that's exactly what it looks like. Now the inferior orbital fissure, it will be formed, as you can see right over here from this image, by several bones. But the main bones are going to be the sphenoid, which is the bone here in green, the maxilla, and the zygomatic bone. But there's also a little bit of the palatine bone that will form the inferior orbital fissure. Next, we have the foramen rotundum. The foramen rotundum is going to be an opening right over here, where foramen means whole and rotundum means round. Then we have one in the middle that looks a little bit oval, and this is why it's called foramen ovale. And the third one, which is this small little tiny hole over there, is called the foramen spinosum. So these are the bone features for the sphenoid bone. I added this image so we can go in a little bit more detail with regards to the sphenoid foramina. Foramina is the plural of foramen. These are superior views, and this last one is an inferior view. Over here, we can see the sella turcica right here in the middle. These would be your optic canal on a superior view of the skull. And here you have the three little holes that are the foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum. The way I remember these three is by thinking of Ross, foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum. Remember that the rotundum is more anterior compared to the spinosum that's more posterior. And the one in the middle is not round, it's oval. So if you can find the foramen ovale, then if you look at a hole that's anterior, it's going to be the foramen rotundum. If you look at a little hole that's posterior, it's going to be the foramen spinosum. If we come over here on the middle image, we can see right over here the oval hole. So this is your foramen ovale. And this one is posterior to the foramen ovale. So this is your foramen spinosum. On this image, we can't really see the foramen rotundum, which is hidden right over there. Now, don't get these holes confused with this big hole over here, which is called the foramen lacerum. And this is when the occipital and the sphenoid bone come together to leave this hole that's called the foramen lacerum. On an inferior view, we can see the holes as well. This one here would be your foramen lacerum, and this one would be the one that belongs to the sphenoid bone. Since this is oval, this is your foramen ovale, and this one, notice how your jaw is over here, so this is anterior and this is posterior, so this little hole over here would be your foramen spinosum. And again, we can't really see the foramen rotundum, which is located underneath this little flap of bone right over there. The unpaired ethmoid bone is this very delicate bone that's located in the interior part of the cranial floor, and you can see from this image how it's located right between the two orbits, and it will also be located inferior to the nasal bones, which are right over there. This image shows the isolated ethmoid bone, and you can see how it's very complex, and it has these little pockets over here, which is what classifies this bone as a pneumatized bone. A few of the bone features that you need to know of the ethmoid bone are this structure that sticks out over here that's called the crista galli. In other words, the rooster's crest. Right underneath it, we're going to have what we call the cribriform plate, which is where the olfactory nerves will pass through from the nasal cavity. Then we have what we call the superior nasal conchae and the middle nasal conchae. Right over here, this would be your superior, this would be your middle, and these will sit inside of the nasal cavity, which is the space right over here in the middle. And they're going to be important to make sure that the air that we inspire gets swirled within the nasal cavity. And the last bone feature that you need to know is the perpendicular plate right over here. Here we can see in a little bit more details the bone features that I was talking about that belongs to the ethmoid bone. This is a superior view of the ethmoid bone by itself. Again, this is also a superior view. This means that this bone here, which is enlarged in this image, will be located right over there. What we can see on the superior view is the crista galli, which is this bone portion right over here, which is the thing that sticks up right over there. And then we're going to see the cribriform plate, which is the structure over here with these tiny little holes where the olfactory nerve will pass through, and that's located right over there. So this is your cribriform plate. Now the perpendicular plate, it will go inside of the nasal cavity. So this is your nasal cavity, and the perpendicular plate is this top half of the nasal cavity, and it will separate the nasal cavity into two compartments, a right and a left compartment, together with this other bone, which is called the vomer. So later on, we will talk about the two structures that form what we call the nasal septum. On this sagittal view, mid-sagittal view, we can see the ethmoid bone here in orange. You can see the crista galli sticking up just a little bit on the top, and then this part would be the superior nasal conchae, and this would be the middle nasal conchae. And these are part of the ethmoid bone, like I said earlier. We do have another nasal conchae that's called the inferior nasal conchae, and this is a bone of its own. So it's a separate bone. It does not belong to another bone. So it's not a bone feature of another bone. It's a bone on its own, the inferior nasal conchae.